Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. The Trumpet staff gained a valuable peek into Washington's inner workings last month when Congressman James Lankford gave a legislative update here at Armstrong Auditorium. Congressman Lankford, who represents Oklahoma's 5th District in the U.S. House, made one particularly unsettling statement about technocrats. He quoted Cass Sunstein, who headed the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs for most of President Obama's first term. This powerful office oversees governmental regulations. And here's what Mr. Lankford said about Sunstein.
He has a book, and he actually testified in front of my committee one time. He has a book where he wrote a statement in there that said a well-educated group of technocrats, that's his word, a well-educated group of technocrats will make more efficient decisions than a democracy. The implication of what he's trying to say is so many of these issues are so complicated, if we tried to make that decision together, we would make the wrong decision. So we should actually have a well-educated group, small group, that they make the decision and tell us what to do is the right thing. A well-educated group of technocrats will make more efficient decisions than a democracy. That belief is spread across the administration.
Congressman Lankford went on to give a specific example of how this thinking works.
For instance, when we did transportation, highway funding bill about 2 years ago, that group wants the federal government to be able to oversee road construction from highways all the way to your driveway. Because the more that they can control road construction, they can control all the environmental laws around the construction, how it's done, the pavement. They feel like they can best choose what materials will go best in that area. If your county government were to build that bridge, who knows if that'd work or not. If we did it as the federal government, we know that we could be trusted. And so they continue to push out to get to more and more roads and more streets to say there should really be a federal component to those. And their implication is every road leads to an interstate highway. And interstate highways are federal responsibilities, but you can't get to the interstate highways without all the feeder roads. So we should also have responsibility for feeder roads.
So these technocrats believe they are the only ones responsible enough to manage such decisions. Although the words well-educated group of technocrats didn't come out of the president's mouth, that thinking underlines much of what his administration is doing. Consider the president's broken promise about the Affordable Care Act. Over the past 3 years, he repeatedly said, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan, period. But now the administration says that promise didn't really apply to what they call substandard health care plans. And what is substandard? Well, only the technocrats know. Anyone can see some of the problems with the Obamacare system right now, but listen to what the congressman said about the Affordable Care Act.
You will already hear people say that the problems that exist with Obamacare and the prices that are going up are not the fault of Obamacare, it's the fault of the insurance companies. The implication with that is, if private insurance wasn't doing this, the government was doing it, it would be better. That's the implication. And you're going to hear that mantra come more and more out of the administration. I've heard it a lot the last 2 weeks, and to me it perks my ears up every time I hear someone say, it's the insurance companies that do this, it's the insurance companies that are doing it. So the implication is, if only they weren't doing that, we were, it would be better. I have heard over and over again that the problems that exist in the economy are not that the federal government has too much power, is that they don't have enough. If they only had more authority to make the complete decision, it would go better.
These technocrats are convinced that they're able to successfully run the insurance business, healthcare, the energy sector, car manufacturing, banking, home mortgages, and a growing list of other mammoth complex industries. No problem is beyond their capacity to solve. They're issuing edicts, handing down regulations, taking on new projects, and gobbling up the private sector at an unprecedented rate. Government spending now accounts for nearly half of the total U.S. economy. Just think about that number for a moment. What proof do these well-educated technocrats have of their own capabilities? Right now, the big joke in America is that over $100 million in federal money couldn't buy a functional website. But how can failures teach them if they believe these problems are because they don't have enough power yet? The technocrats have a "you just have to trust us" attitude. We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what's in it, they said about Obamacare. It forcefully brings to mind the wisdom of Jeremiah 17 in verse 5, which says, "Cursed be the man that trusts in man." Ron Fraser wrote in the Trumpet for years about how the European Union was filled with technocrats, these unelected, unaccountable individuals who think they know what's best for everyone else, expanded government and amassed power in tiny increments, almost without notice. This is a well-traveled road to catastrophe. History is littered with societies wrecked by such powerful, self-delusional people. Stalin and his technocrats were so convinced of their own wisdom that they imprisoned and murdered untold millions of their own people trying to realize their vision. "Power is a poison well known for thousands of years," wrote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who spent 11 years in the Russian gulags. He said, "To the human being who has faith in some force that holds dominion over all of us, and who is therefore conscious of his own limitations, power is not necessarily fatal. For those, however, who are unaware of any higher sphere, it is a deadly poison. For them, there is no antidote." This is perhaps what is most alarming about watching the steady, unstoppable expansion of power by America's highest officials at the expense of our freedoms. There seems to be nothing restraining them. They lack humility and are so unaware of their own limitations. And they're not answerable to anyone but themselves. Power without accountability is deadly. We're simply too susceptible to vanity. Pride grows in the human heart like lard on a pig, Solzhenitsyn wrote. America's founders understood the dangers of unaccountable power. They engineered the government with checks and balances specifically aimed at restraining well-educated technocrats. Sadly, it is these very restraints that the current administration feels obliged by virtue of its own brilliance to either ignore or demolish.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
As America's chief diplomat, are you being skeptical enough about a man who has been called a wolf in sheep's clothing, who wrote a book in which he talked about how they can continue work on their nuclear program while they gain confidence of the West, basically played games with the West? Are you being skeptical enough?
David, some of the most serious and capable expert people in our government who've spent a lifetime dealing both with Iran as well as with nuclear weapons and nuclear armament and proliferation are engaged in our negotiation. We are not blind, and I don't think we're stupid.
That was U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry trying to diffuse a very tense situation brought on by the deal that almost went through between Western powers and Iran this past weekend. We talked about that quite a bit more yesterday, but he was on Meet the Press Sunday trying also to mend the fence there between the United States and Israel because, as we told you yesterday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had such a strong reaction of opposition against what the United States was pushing for last Friday. Let me just quote to you what one Israeli cabinet member had to say about that deal that the United States was trying to reach with Iran. on Friday. He writes, this is from Rudy Bennett's website, it says, these critical days in November will be remembered for years to come. So we really have reached a critical point, a boiling point, I guess you could say, depending on how you look at it. And that's what this cabinet member is saying. He says the free world stands before a fork in the road with a clear choice: either stand strong and insist Iran dismantles its nuclear weapons program, or surrender, cave in, and allow Iran to retain its 18,500 centrifuges. This is the fork in the road. We've reached that point. He writes, years from now, when an Islamic terrorist blows up a suitcase in New York, or when Iran launches a nuclear missile at Rome or Tel Aviv, it will have happened only because a bad deal was made during these defining moments. And now that deal hasn't yet gone through. It's just been set aside for a few days. We'll see what happens in the days ahead as we push toward some kind of an arrangement that's being spearheaded by the United States. This cabinet member says it's not enough to shut off the centrifuges. They need to be completely dismantled. And of course, this is what Mr. Netanyahu was so upset about with the deal that they were discussing last week, which really was the first phase of a very bad deal. They were discussing just slowing things down just a tad, but not dismantling anything, not destroying their capability of producing a nuclear weapon. Things are definitely tense. Even our representative over in Jerusalem reported this morning that as many times as he's been to Israel over the years with all of our excavations and such, he hasn't seen it quite like this since he's been there. There's just a lot of people in Israel on edge, not only about what's happening in Iran, but about what's happening to the relationship between the United States and Israel. The crisis between these two nations, which we've said so much about at thetrumpet.com, and even here recently on the Trumpet Daily. That crisis, as I said, it reached a boiling point because the U.S. was off and running to Geneva to try to strike that deal, and Israel just couldn't believe that the U.S. would not only accept such a deal, but that it would actually be pushing the other Western powers to agree to it. And of course, it was France who finally put a stop to it on Saturday, calling it, worse than a bad deal. It said it was basically pursuing a suckers deal. This is from an article Bret Stephens wrote at the Wall Street Journal. He says the talks unexpectedly fell apart at the last minute when the French foreign minister publicly objected to what he called a suckers deal, meaning the U.S. was prepared to begin lifting sanctions on Iran in exchange for tentative Iranian promises that they would slow their multiple nuclear programs. And Stephens goes on and says here, not stop or suspend them, mind you, much less dismantle them, but merely reduce their pace from run to jog when they're on mile 23 of their nuclear marathon. They're right near to the end of the race. He says, it says something about the administration, speaking of the U.S. administration, it says something about the administration that they so wanted a deal that they would have been prepared to take this one. It says a lot about the thinking in Washington. It goes back to what I said there at the top of the show. Just that thinking that they know what's best for everyone else, irrespective of the facts that are on the ground or the number of bombs that may be circulating. They know. It says a lot about the administration that they were hurrying off to and actually behind a deal as bad as what was discussed last week. From Daniel Pipes' website, he's an expert on Middle Eastern affairs. We've heard him speak a number of times over the years. He reminded his readers of this fact. He says, I wrote before the last presidential election that Israel's troubles will really begin should Obama win a second term. At Obama's second inauguration, I predicted that he, quote, freed from re-election constraints, can finally express his early anti-Zionist views after a decade of political positioning. Watch for a markedly worse tone from the second Obama administration toward the third Netanyahu government, close quote. And then he goes on and says, after quoting himself, that the moment is now upon us. That moment where the administration is no longer concerned about a re-election bid, and so we're really beginning to see the true colors show, and you can see it in this hostility toward Israel. Now, as we've been telling you all along, this break in the brotherhood, as Zechariah 11 says, is prophesied. God said it would happen, so we're not surprised by this, but you can certainly see why we're discussing it as much as we are, because we're seeing prophecy being fulfilled. I mean, based on that prophecy in Zechariah 11, that's why we were saying many, many, many years ago, even when the relationship between the two, the U.S. and Israel, was so strong, we were saying the same things as Mr. Pipes was, leading up to the re-election bid last year. In fact, if you go back to 2008, just when Senator Obama was gaining in popularity, we wrote an article at the Trumpet.com asking if Barack Obama was change that Israel could believe in. And it's a pretty lengthy article that really goes into a lot of his background, his radical past, and some of his controversial associations, many of them having anti-Israel views, strong anti-Israel views. And as we said in 2008, of course, this is not going to be good for Israel. And now we're seeing it play out. Even last year, leading up to the elections, Charles Krauthammer, the columnist, said, "Not since its birth has Israel been so cast adrift by its closest ally." So many have started to take note of what has happened between these two brothers. Let me continue from that Bret Stephens article and just finish a thought here before we conclude. He writes, "This now puts the French," speaking of France putting a stop to the discussion this past weekend, he says, "This now puts the French at the head of the de facto axis of reality, the other prominent members of which are Saudi Arabia and Israel. In this axis, strategy is not a game of World of Warcraft conducted via avatars in a virtual reality. We're not blind, and I don't think we're stupid," a defensive John Kerry said over the weekend on Meet the Press. And then Stephens goes on and says, "When you've reached the don't call me stupid stage of diplomacy, it means the rest of the world has your number." And that's true. That's true. He says, now the question is whether the French are staking out a position at Geneva or simply demanding to be heard. If it's the latter, notice this, he says, if it's the latter, the episode will be forgotten and Jerusalem and Riyadh will have to reach their own conclusions about how to operate in a post-American Middle East. That's what Saudi Arabia and Israel are going to have to figure out, is how are they to operate in a post-American world. We've got a new issue of the Trumpet Magazine coming out in just a few weeks that's going to dwell on that very subject from cover to cover almost, the post-American world. We're seeing it happen before our eyes in the Middle East. America is gone. America's influence is leaving. And it just sets the stage for so many other prophecies to be fulfilled. And we're seeing quite an acceleration in those prophecies. Now, we've pointed out since Rouhani came on the scene back in June how that there's really no difference. I mean, it's the same mullah administration that's running the country, and that certainly is true. But the big difference was highlighted by Benjamin Netanyahu, but actually back at the UN. We highlighted that speech last week. And he talked about how Ahmadinejad was a wolf in wolf's clothing, but how Rouhani is a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're both wolves, but the thing is, the Western powers don't see it that way. Certainly the Obama administration doesn't see it that way. And what's really critical about that transition back in June is that the mullahs knew, I mean, they were in a desperate situation. They needed those sanctions to be lifted so that their country can survive. They were being hit hard by it. And Ahmadinejad was getting them nowhere. And so they inserted another smooth talker. And look at what it's gotten them. look at what has already been happening, even since Rouhani came on the scene. So a lot of things are happening that's actually accelerating these prophecies. We've highlighted so often Hosea 5 in verse 13 how that Judah is going to go over to Assyria for help. That certainly is part of this post-American world. Hosea 5 and verse 13, we've talked a lot about that Psalm 83 alliance, those powers that are going to unite with Germany and rise against the king of the south, the Iranian-led king of the south. And then, of course, we've talked so much about Daniel 11 and verse 40 over the years, that this clash that's going to happen between Europe, the heart of Europe, Germany in particular, and Iran, the clash between the kings of the north and the king of the south, So you've got all these major prophecies, and what is the one thing that they all have in common, whether it's Psalm 83 or Hosea 5:13 or Daniel 11 verse 40? In all three of those cases, you have the United States absent from these earth-shaking prophecies. The United States is gone. And that's because we're moving into a post-American world. And you can see it in just about any region you look at, as will be highlighted in the next issue of the Trumpet Magazine. So when that is hot off the press, we'll make sure and show you what that cover looks like and encourage you to become a monthly subscriber to the magazine. For now, I'll just highlight the King of the South booklet, which talks a lot about the prophecy in Daniel 11 in particular, and talks about what we've been saying about Iran for the past 20 years as it heads up that King of the South movement. So make sure you send in your request. You can request the King of the South at our website, thetrumpet.com. All right, we're going to end with something a little bit lighter today. This past Sunday, we had our second annual 5K run here on campus. Quite a few people participated in it. And so we'll let you enjoy some nice music and some video highlights from this 5K run. We'll see you next time.
Of a far-off place where a hero's welcome would be waiting for me, where my Father smiles when he sees my face, and a voice keeps saying, "This is where I'm meant to be. I'll be there someday. I can go the distance, I will find my way. If I can be strong, I know every mile will be worth my while. When I go the distance, I'll be right where I belong. Down an unknown road to embrace my fate. Though that road may wander, it will lead me to you. And 1,000 years would be worth the wait. It might take a lifetime, but somehow I'll see it through, and I won't look back. I can go the distance, I will stay on track. No, I won't accept defeat. It's an uphill slope, but I won't lose hope till I go the and my journey is complete. Oh, to see beyond the trials is the hardest part. I must keep the vision burning in my heart. Like a shooting star, I can go the distance. I will search the world. I will face its harms. I don't care how far. I can go the distance till I find my hero's welcome waiting in your arms.
I survived. I stayed alive.